Thanks so much. Oh, I've got Thank you so much, and thank you for welcoming me to be here with you today. Are the mic volumes okay? All right, great. Okay, so my presentation I entitled The Arthouse Wins, Throwing the Dice That Fuel Inclusion, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, but I always love to start out with a little bit of music. So that was Hannah, who is, of course, amazing. In addition to starting with a little bit of music, I always love to reference the idea that, for example, what Hannah does is a testament to her abilities, to her talent, but it is also a testament to the institutions and the people that impacted and empowered her life and her trajectory. And so I just want you to think about that when we think about the things that we do as institutions and as people, because they truly transform people's lives, and that's what Sphinx's mission is transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. So I believe that art houses can win as we think about how our society is moving forward, and I have a profound connection that I feel to the field that I'll talk about a little bit in just a second. And that is really through, as I mentioned, throwing the dice, diversity, innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship. But I figure if we're going to spend a little time and talk together here about this work that we all do, that I should start at the very beginning. So I was born on, of all days, 9/11. In upstate New York, and I was immediately given up for adoption. I was adopted by a white Jewish couple who were from Chicago, who were neuroscientists. They also already had a birth son, my older brother, who is now a cellular biologist and biogeneticist at Columbia in New York. So you can get this sense I was literally the black sheep of the family. I'm growing up, they're all scientists, they're very methodical and very measured, and I was spontaneous and emotional and artistic and all of these things, but hopefully I combined the best of all of those worlds in terms of my own trajectory. Fast forward 31 years, I was reunited with my birth parents, my birth father, who's black Jehovah's Witness, and my birth mother, who is white Irish Catholic, who not only ended up getting back together, but had another child who they did raise, my full sister, who has become unbelievably close, and we talk almost every day. So basically, in the end, if you kind of look at who I am a black, white, Jewish, Irish Catholic, Jehovah's Witness, who grew up with a big afro and played the violin. So if you're wondering why there are some diversity themes that go through my life, that is why. So to kind of get back to kind of this development, as I was growing up, and I'm going to kind of try and cover this a little bit quickly because there's also a fair amount of data that I want to be able to share with you during this time together. But my mother, my adoptive mother, was an amateur violinist, and so I became really taken by the instrument, and I began to study, and I had a great opportunity to learn from some of the great violin teachers, especially very early on in my life. And so that began to develop initially in New York, where I was at the 92nd Street Y and studied with Vladimir Grafman. And then at the age of 10, I moved from New York, from Midtown Manhattan to Hershey, Pennsylvania, which at the time had one black family and all the chocolate and me. That was it. And actually, while I was in Hershey, I was very ostracized. And so my violin became incredibly close to me. My ability to be able to speak through that instrument became my primary way of connecting with other people. And in addition to my violin, one of the other great solaces that I had was our independent theater that we had in Hershey. And I was able to start working there, and not only that, I was getting kicked out and running away. I had a bit of a troubled time period as I was trying to figure out my own identity. And so I had the keys. This is a very, very, small theater. And so I would sleep on the floor of the theater, just right in front of the screen. And I also learned how to run the platter systems and did all of that at a very early age. And so the idea of film, literally film, and how it connected with me was a great solace during that time period. I ended up then going to the Interlochen Arts Academy, which I credit with saving my life, and again, the role of an institution. Started out at Penn State and then ended up finishing my degrees at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, where I got my undergraduate and graduate degrees. And it was there that I started thinking about all of these issues surrounding diversity. And as a student, I said, it's not just good enough to sit and complain and wonder why is this the case, that I go to orchestra concerts and don't see anyone of color, we don't play any music by people of color, et cetera, but what could I do about it? And that led to founding Sphinx, for which I'll have a short video in just a moment for you to be able to see. But I figured if we talk about this, one of the things that I learned from my scientific parents was that if you're going to look at any particular type of problem, you have to quantify it. It is not good enough to just dream and say, this would just be so nice. It would be so wonderful if we diversified classical music. What does that mean? How do we measure it? If we do it, how will we know when we're done? What will the classical music field look like? So it became very important to quantify these issues. So I wanted to share some of this data with you and then share some of the data from your field as well. So no big surprise when we look at American orchestras, which is one of the best barometers not only for classical music, not only for orchestras, but for classical music, and not only that, but most of the other classical performing arts disciplines have very similar numbers. Not all of them track them as well as orchestras do, but basically are about a little under 2% black, a little over 2% Latino. Asians are a little over 7%, and the remaining are white. And the very interesting thing is that this reflects huge changes in the field, more than a doubling. But the vast majority of those gains are not amongst large orchestras. So one of the rarities is actually the number of African Americans has doubled in large orchestras. In every single case where there's been an increase of the number of African Americans in a major orchestra, either the person who joined the orchestra was an alum of a Sphinx program, or the orchestra was a partner of the Sphinx organization. That is, and actually, thank you for applauding, but what it means is that any institution, any idea can bring about systemic change in a field. I am not smarter than any of you. Any person in this room can bring about the same level of change in your field. And that's one of the things that I discovered. And of course, the Sphinx has a huge role in terms of being a catalyst. So the results of that, while there is that factor to it, there's many other things that went into the development of those young people who joined those orchestras. And the orchestras themselves and the way they go about hiring, which is a key thing as well. So I'll go through some of these very quick. No big surprise, music directors, our conductors are about 2% black, 2% Latino. Executive directors, less than half of 1% are black, less than 1% are Latino. Artistic administrators, so other than the conductor, the key person running run-out concerts, determining repertoire for American orchestras, statistically 0% are black or Latino across America's 1,200 orchestras. Even if we look at education and community directors, these are the people directly charged with engaging with their communities. It's still only 3% for blacks and 2% for Latinos. So one of the quotes from Robert Redford that I thought really spoke to me very strongly as I was thinking about some of the things, and especially some of the inspirations initially behind Sundance, and also how diversity is viewed. Some of my closest friends for life, who I went to Interlochen with, are deeply involved in the film industry. And he says, I was concerned that we would lose one of the most valuable aspects of filmmaking, which was diversity. So that's what started Sundance. Diversity comes out of the word independence. It's an automatic thing. If you're independently minded, you're going to do things different from the common form. Therefore, you're going to have more diverse products. So as I began to look at this again, I thought it was important for us to look at what are some of the climate. What is the current situation like in film as we look at it to say, what is it that we can actually do to bring about diversity? So first, this is now not just looking at independent, but all film directors. So if we look at all film directors, no big surprise, they are almost 90% white, about 12% are what are considered underrepresented. Now, if we look at independent film directors, here's where it's interesting, where it's almost double. It's actually 20% are underrepresented, 80% are white. So which is a positive factor in terms of the independent film industry, but of course, overall, it's not ideal. Another thing that I thought was important is when we think about directors, it's not just that one role, but do directors have influence over the other things that happen surrounding a film? And of course, they do. So when a director of color helms an independent film project, there is a percentage increase of the underrepresented characters that are then seen on screen. And that is 44%. So that is the direct increase by having a director of color. And this information, the stuff that I'm sharing with you that's relating to both the entire film industry, comes from this comprehensive Annenberg report on diversity, which if you haven't seen it, I certainly encourage you to. It's an incredible treasure trove of valuable data and information. So I wanted to go on and specifically look, and this is now from the audience survey of Arthouse patrons, because I thought that some of this was really interesting information. So if we take a look at just the overall population, because one of the things as I was starting out at Sphinx was that it was not my goal to start an affirmative action entity or initiative. I did not go into Sphinx with the purpose of uplifting a particularly underserved community. I went into it with the purpose of diversifying the field and the artistic medium that I loved and that had built my life. And that was the way in which I thought it's just critically important to our society. So those are two different things. So as part of that, it's important to look and say, well, what are the most underrepresented groups in our field? Because if we want to build diversity and inclusion, that is where indeed we should focus. So 62% overall of our population is white. 92% of our Arthouse patrons are white. When we look at Latinos, they're about 18% in the overall population, but they represent only 4% of our audiences. Asian American, 8%, and again, 2%, and blacks, 12%, and 2%. So obviously what we can see from this is that there is indeed a dramatic underrepresentation amongst audiences. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But one of the things that interested me as part of this survey is that they posed this question of what percentage of those who are leading art houses and involved in the staff of art houses believe that we have been successful engaging with people of different races and cultures in our community. And the answer was 83%. So that raised a question as I came to come and have a dialogue and talk to you about, which is not, goes beyond kind of what I'm saying, which is that there are things that we can do, and I think about everything that's going on in the Michigan Theater, in Ann Arbor. Unbelievable outreach, right? And where I feel incredibly welcomed, and there's an incredible amount of diversity. But sometimes we do have to, despite our own anecdotal experiences, step back and make sure that we look at our field and that we measure what is happening systemically. Because oftentimes our own direct experiences can color, no pun intended, what is actually occurring in our field. And this is something that has occurred in the classical music field and other fields, business, as they've begun to diversify. And that's why this data is so important, to look at it, to think about it, and then to track it and measure success. Because that's what helps us to identify what initiatives work and what don't. And through that, we begin to learn a lot. So one last slide that I wanted to share with, related directly, now this is to all films, right? Now this is going to underrepresented characters that we have with a white director, a director of color. So when we look at those with underrepresented characters, when we have a white director, it's about 21% in all films now, not just independent films. Once we have, oh, let's see what happened there. Once we then go to a director of color, the percentage of underrepresented characters leaps, right, to 50%. The percentage of films with no non-white character whatsoever, 50% of all films only have white people. That was a shock to me. Of the top 100 films that had a black director, in 2007, it was about 7%. Which I was like, that's interesting, but you know, these are just the top 100 films. These are major, major films, huge enterprises, so 7%. The problem was that they tracked this is again from the Annenberg study, which tracked over 5 years. The number is not going up, it's going down. And it went down to about 5% in 2012. Also, and this came up in our great morning session that we had, the issue of especially female directors, and in this case, female directors of color. So over these 5 years, of the 500 top films over those 5 years, there was a particular number of black female directors. 2. The last thing I wanted to share with you is writers. So of course, writers and how they're involved in the field is also very important, but there is a wage gap between white writers and writers who are writers of color. And that wage gap is $20,000. And again, this information comes from the Annenberg study. So I raised these issues, and so one last thing that I wanted to share with you, because this is actually, not only is it informative, but it also raises an additional interesting point. So if we look at, again, now this is moviegoers. For all films, those who support the movie industry, people of color are overrepresented. For example, we'll just do those who are Hispanic, right? In the overall population, they're 18%, yet they're 20% of moviegoers and 21% of ticket buyers, total tickets sold. African American, 12%, but 14%. So the underrepresentation exists in an industry where its consumer base are actually overrepresented, except in independent films, those who attend art houses. Art houses, audiences are underrepresented. So again, this is just very important information to know, because that can fuel action. And there may be some who choose not to do something about it, but if you choose not to do something about it, make that choice knowing the reality that exists in the field. I think to myself, what if the numbers were different? What if the stories were different? One of my favorite quotes, I'm going to have a few quotes here this evening, is from Chimamanda Adichie, a famed Nigerian author. She has a great TED Talk, but she talks about this danger of a single story. And she says the danger is not that it is untrue, but that it is incomplete. The stories that are being woven in this field, our field, and who the stories are being told to are incomplete. That is not in question. The only question is, what can we do about it, and what should we do about it, and is it important? And I can just share from personal experience related, especially to classical music, but a lot of the performing arts, it matters more than ever, because our stories must be complete, that we tell of the breadth of diverse people that we have that comprise our society. So I think about, with orchestras, What if they had been doing what Bernstein did 50 years ago? 50 years ago, he was writing letters to the Urban League, to the Congress on Racial Equality, telling them about auditions they were having at the New York Philharmonic. He was writing open letters in the field. It's 50 years ago. And I thought about, what are orchestra leaders doing today? And what if they had continued that trajectory that just one person did? What if all music education programs were more effective at developing those diverse students to become musicians? What if screen arts programs and nonprofit management programs prepared a more diverse range of students who would be entering into your field? What if your art house was as diverse as our nation? What would it sound like? One of the questions that I asked when I went into higher education and became a dean, and I was talking with faculty as well, I said, how would it feel? What would be different if you walked around the halls and 90% of our faculty were black? Would the conversations be different? What if 90% of our students were black? Would the conversations be different? As we begin to shift diversity and we begin to bring and make environments more inclusive, things do change, and that does bring about a level of uncomfortability. And we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable in this work that we do. So instead of kind of telling you about a host of these just different things that Sphinx does, I wanted to kind of share, it's about a 4-minute video that will give you a sense of its work, and I want you to ideally just take a look at it from the sense of what might be applicable, what aspects of programming could be replicated, could be modified or evolved to impact our own art house or our own field.
The perception that the talent isn't out there within communities of color is so deeply false in classical music.
Wow, drop the mic. There are millions of kids like this in this country who do not have the resources to become everything that they could be. But fortunately, these programs are doing the job that the bigger society fails to do.
Sphinx's mission is transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. And we address the issue of lack of diversity and inclusion through a sense of a pipeline. We have Overture program replace violins in the hands of young people for the first time.
I definitely believe that the Sphinx Overture program has made a difference in this community.
The Sphinx competition is our flagship program. It's a wholesome approach to musician development that goes beyond the competitive mechanism. Sphinx Connect is the epicenter for artists and leaders in diversity, devoted to the issues of inclusion, leadership, and career advancement. We have Sphinx Symphony, which is a professional, all African American and Latino orchestra. And then we have the Sphinx Virtuosi, which is an ensemble of soloists that performs across the country, everywhere from Carnegie Hall to Harris Theater in Chicago, and really communities beyond.
I think the Sphinx organization is so incredibly important. It tries to achieve in our society an equilibrium of people who are incredibly talented and motivated to be part of every aspect of our society.
Sphinx has done tremendous work over its first 20 years. And I think that over the next 20 years, Sphinx will truly transform the lives of millions of more people. So The fearless leader of Sphinx is here, Dworkin. Will you just stand for a quick second? And Afa's been leading the organization in unbelievable ways for the past, now going on almost 3 years. But I think about, for example, what if there had been no Sphinx? And I think back to Hannah and the impact on her life. This role that we can play with initiatives as institutions is powerful. And so I would ask, what if you do nothing differently after the speech than you did before it? What is the price that would be paid from those who would otherwise be impacted by the work that you do? One of my favorite quotes is from Susan Scott, who leads and has developed a lot of human resource systems and things like that. And one of the things that she talks about is this idea that our work, our relationships, and in fact our lives succeed one conversation at a time. And while no single conversation is guaranteed to change the trajectory of your life, any conversation can. So speak and listen as if this is the most important conversation you will ever have with this person, because it could be. Participate as if it matters, because it does. And I think about the conversations that you're already having and will have over the next several days. And so many of them could have this impact. I've seen it. I think about in my own life, some conversations that I didn't approach this way, and the trajectory of my life went in one direction or the other because I didn't have that level of attentiveness. So I encourage you to do that over the next several days. One of the things, before I kind of get to a few just closing points, was that I wanted to talk a little bit about building creative careers, because I think that institutions that are creative and entrepreneurial are because they have team members who are creative and entrepreneurial. And we can develop these types of people. And I think that there are some components that comprise that we can learn from for ourselves as well as for our institutions. So they are, first, innovation. And it's not just simple enough to be like, well, let's just be innovative. Brene Brown is, again, a leading organizational theorist, talks about this and said, there is no innovation and creativity without failure, period. You must be prepared to fail. And so many people kind of say that, and it's kind of hip now to say, oh, we're really into failing and stuff like that. But I don't see it. I see it in a lot of books. I see a lot of people like to talk about it, but I don't see a lot of people actually practicing failure. I don't see a lot of people in the higher ed world. I don't see a lot of people in the classical music field. And I haven't seen a lot of people necessarily, even in the independent film world or in the art house world, failing regularly. But we have to if we're innovating. It is just simply a numbers game. If you're trying more things that no one else has done, you are going to fail more. So if you aren't failing at all, something is wrong. And we have to be able to become more comfortable with failure. So innovation is key. Oh, thank you. Failing. But I can guarantee you, all you have to do, you could probably pick up the phone and talk to any faculty member at the University of Michigan, say, has Aaron failed? Yes, at some point. You can talk to anyone at Sphinx, has Aaron failed? You can just talk to Afa. Has Aaron failed? Yes, in a host of ways. So, but every one of those failures, and I'm actually going to talk about that in a second as it relates to a portfolio life, the next step in my life would not have been possible without that failure. Writing, it's just very simple. We have to be able to write. We have to be able to depict and articulate what it is that we're trying to do on paper. Obviously for grants and for so on and so forth and for a host of different things, but we must be able to do that, and it's required by people and institutions, both of which I think there is an incredible dearth. I have encountered some incredible institutions where literally there is no one who really there has the ability to articulate what that institution is doing well to people who don't know them. Incredibly powerful, incredibly important. Entrepreneurship, just the actual acts of how do you develop the ability to build a sustainable enterprise around these ideas that we have, around this work that we do. Critically important, I won't go through all of these, but for example, at our Excel department at Michigan, we do it through coursework, through workshops, through support, advising, and through empowering. We actually now provide more direct grants to students for their own entrepreneurial projects than any other performing arts school. And the one thing that you'll see through all of this and that all of you are doing, especially around the bar, but is networking. It is critically important. Again, the work that Sphinx has been able to do would not have been possible without the networking that they've done. And then the last I wanted to just talk about related to these aspects of a creative career is this idea of portfolio career or a portfolio life. A lot of times students have talked to me and they're like, oh yeah, well I'm just going to do this. I'm going to be in a dance company, or I'm going to be in a theater company, or I'm just going to go out and be an actor, or I'm going to be a writer, those types of things. And so I begin to encourage them to think about building a portfolio career, a portfolio life, because the reality is that most of those in the arts have that in one way, shape, or form, but in most cases it wasn't intentional. And that is something that is critically important that we be able to do, because you can actually have intentionality about a portfolio life. So what I wanted to just share really quickly is that I had a historical portfolio life, and then I'm going to share what my actual life is now. So obviously I had Sphinx, which I had started and been working on. I had a memoir that I wrote. I had my various board service. I did write, direct, and produce an independent film that I think 7 people saw, which was called Deliberation, although it feels like was. Jumpstart, which was the homeless organization that I founded, and so I have to tell this just very quick story about the Jumpstart organization. First Adventure of Chili Peppers, by the way, is a children's book that I wrote. But during a period of time, I had very significant financial issues, and my partner at the time and I were almost homeless, and we had people who stayed with us who were homeless. So homelessness was a huge issue. We had delved into it and found innovative ways to try and address it, and we had been working on those. But unfortunately, the organization was failing. We didn't have a car. We didn't have really any way to sustain ourselves either. And as a last-ditch effort, we wrote letters to Robin Williams and to Whoopi Goldberg and to, oh my gosh, Comic Relief. Yes, to Billy Crystal. And that's crazy that I had forgotten his name at that point. And with this sense of, well, they must care about this issue. Why wouldn't they? And didn't hear anything, and the organization actually had to fold. And then one day we got a call, and it was Marsha Williams, which is, I'm calling about a letter to my husband, Robin Williams. And so we're like, oh my God, what are we talking to Marsha Williams? And so this led to about an hour-and-a-half conversation through which we shared that what we had been trying to do, and that unfortunately the organization had to fold. And we just wanted to be able to get back into school. I had started at Penn State. We had to drop out. She was white. Her parents, disowned her. This whole 9 yards of things that have happened, unfortunately, to a number of people in our country. And so we had been kind of, just trying to make it. And I had been on the outs with my parents for different reasons. And so we just wanted to get back to school, but when you owe a school money, they wouldn't release transcripts, right? So all of our loans were in debt, the whole 9 yards. She says, well, send Robin and I copies of your student loans, and we'll see what we can do. So we're like, we sent all of the copies of our student loans, and I had given a recital as an undergraduate, sent a copy of the recital and some of my poetry that I had written, all of that. Meanwhile, we send it off. We then get evicted because we weren't able to pay rent. I ended up getting a job in the mailroom of a company, in a marketing company, and she got a position as a receptionist at a law firm. We got into a new place, had our mail forwarded, and got this letter from Joel Faden Financial Companies, which I will never forget. And it said, enclosed, please find copies of checks made out in your behalf from Robin Williams' account. And he had paid off all of our loans to Penn State, which freed up our transcripts, which is the only way I was able to end up going back to the University of Michigan, where I got my degrees and founded Sphinx, again, still as an underclassman, and had caught all of our federal loans up out of default. didn't know us whatsoever. The outreach and our ability to articulate in writing, primarily, what we were experiencing and what we were trying to do in the world mattered to someone who didn't know us at all. It was unbelievably powerful, and obviously the tragedy of his passing, the loss is not just industry-wide, but there are so many people whose lives were impacted. And I also raise it to say that then he continued to support, and actually it was several years into Sphinx that he then shared some support through the Windfall Foundation. But he said, you know, if we would have known that you would have actually gone on to do some of the things that you did, we probably would have given you more money. So I was like, well, thank you, that was great. But the impact that you can have on other people can be truly powerful. And that's why when I talk about Hannah and when I stand up here before you today, having had the unbelievable blessing to do the work that I do, it is not remotely because of the soul work that I've brought to bear, but the combination of the commitment of so many other people and institutions that did these types of things. So in terms of portfolio career, I had a literary magazine, The Bard, that had about 60,000 readers, Common Ground, which was a pilot that we did for a show that was kind of a little bit based around a politically incorrect style. They Said I Wasn't Really Black was a poetry book. 20 to 6 was an interview show online that I did. Battle of the Bricks was a Lego building competition where we actually got 1 million bricks sent to us from Lego and did all of that. EarthPro was actually an environmental telecommunications company that I had founded. Ethnovibe was my first entertainment company that I started with the first African-American quartets and groups that I started at Michigan. That is Afa and Mai's first CD called Bar Talk, and then second CD, Ebony Rhythm, and then The Catalyst was an entrepreneurial social venture show, kind of like a Shark Tank, long before Shark Tank, pilot that of course didn't get picked up and didn't go anywhere. So that was a historical portfolio. And I say that because most of those things don't exist anymore. Many people could look at them as failures, but they all fueled and informed my work that I do today, which does center around my work at Michigan, where of course I'm on faculty and do teaching. And I always have a priority, but then again, I still do have a role with Sphinx in terms of just being founder and advocating and speaking on behalf of Sphinx. We've also launched a national competition that relates to those who are veterans and being able to empower them and their performing arts careers and trajectories. Aaron Ask is a weekly video mentoring show online that you can go to that is completely free, aaronask.com. I encourage you to check it out. No ads as well. Ethos, I've always been a science fiction buff and deeply committed to the idea of how science fiction enables us to look at social issues today, but speak about them through futuristic mechanisms that enable people to engage in them in a way that they wouldn't otherwise do. And so that is out, and the paperback actually comes out next month. Aaron Dworkin Project is my own performing. Obviously, I do presenting and speaking. I serve on the National Council as well as the Michigan Council, as well as the National Sistema Global. Af and I, we have our family foundation, relatively small, but we try to have an impact in that way. And I am an amateur poker player, and so I've always been obsessed with game design and how to design different games. And so I do actually have a game design company, and then I am actually involved in crypto investments. So that is my portfolio life today. And I encourage all of you in your own lives to intentionally think about how is your life a portfolio life, and especially for those young people that you encounter. One of my favorite quotes from Einstein is that we shouldn't strive to be a success, but rather to be of value. And that is one of the core things that I've always tried to be able to do, is to have whatever skill sets I can bring to bear be of value to someone or to an institution. And I think about what if the Arthouse Convergence was fully comprised of a culturally diverse mosaic of leaders who were prepared with these entrepreneurial skill sets. And this last thing that I wanted to share with you is that a lot of times when we talk about change, people say, well, that's nice to think about and to talk about, but we can't really do it, or there's really these real world situations, and or that's easy to say for organizations that are focused on these issues like diversity, but not necessarily for our art house. We have so many things I've got to worry about, marketing and ticketing and so on and so forth, and we have some of these financial challenges that we're trying to focus on. We simply cannot do that. And I am standing here before you to say, yes, you can do it. And I can say that not only from a perspective from Sphinx, but people used to say that all the time about universities and music schools. They said, that's nice, Sphinx can do all of that, it's focus. You can't really do that. So in the time that I came in, I served as dean for 2 years at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance at Michigan. $60 million school, 180 faculty, 100 staff, big enterprise, embedded at the University of Michigan, which is a multi-billion-dollar, obviously, university, large research university. So it is not easy to bring about change. Yet in that period, we were able to have an over 30% increase in applications and 20% increase in the matriculation of underrepresented minorities at the school, the largest single increase in the history of the school. We doubled the community engagement activities, created leadership roles in finance and inclusion, and that means we funded them. We surpassed our campaign goals, which was over $100 million. We developed live streaming and professional audio recording in all of our schools' venues. We have multiple buildings. We created a chamber music department, created Emprise, which just within 2 years became the largest chamber music competition in the world, created entrepreneurship, leadership, career development department, which didn't previously exist at the school. So I share that to say that you can do those things, but when you do them, it is not easy. You will fail. I've had failures for sure, but the impact, the change that you bring about in the trajectory can affect not only your own institution, but the field as a whole. And so I think about what if the Art House Convergence, if all of you engaged in some disruptive evolution related to inclusion, what would happen? What would the field look like? What if you developed a venture fund for art houses in diverse communities with diverse leadership and empowered those doing that work on the front lines? What if you developed an awards program for members who'd excel in these diversity initiatives? Not only to bring that recognition, but the recognition absolutely motivates, but to provide visibility of these best practices that are taking place in your field so that all of you can benefit from what each other is doing. What if you created a fellowship program for diverse emerging leaders so that no single art house always had to try to strive to say, how can we build a diverse pool for this particular position that we have? But we actually collectively have a group of fellows who are constantly coming into our field who we want to be able to hire. What if you developed a competition for underrepresented filmmakers and made a commitment to release them? So hypothetically, there would be this film competition for young, Black or Latino filmmakers, and 100 members of the Convergence committed to show those. Could be transformative from my perspective and from the conversations with some of the people that I had. And what if you developed partnerships, not just individually, which a number of you I know have been doing, some of them were commented on this morning, which are fantastic, but as a national collective, developed partnerships with community organizations engaging more people of color. So my hope is that my story will encourage each of you to really engage in this process as we move forward. And imagine a future if you were the one who could make this happen, because each and every one of you absolutely are. And finally, I wanted to share two things. One, just kind of this structure of my talk, and then also this public sense of the work that we do in the arts in its totality. So Aristotle's three forms of persuasion, I'm not sure if everyone has heard of them. If not, I definitely encourage you to know them, because in many of the conversations that you have, I think they'll be incredibly important. Ethos, of course, which I love and brought to the title of my book, logos and pathos, right? So ethos, right? That is the character, right? That's why I shared all about, in terms of this aspect of just my personal story, right? You need to understand or know my character if we're really going to be able to have this conversation. I'm going to be able to share these ideas. Logos, you have to share the logic and reason of it. That's why I share the data of these particular issues. And then pathos, which is the emotion, the why. What if? What would our field look like? What would our society look like? If the Arthouse Convergence did all of those things, would we have to be having the national dialogue that we're having on this particular day of all days? I'm not so sure, because the power of the stories that are told in your venues change people's lives and change their perspectives of those who are different than them. It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. So Lyndon Johnson, on signing into existence the NEA, talked about this importance of the arts for our society. So what I wanted to do in this last thing was actually just share with you what is this climate that we work within, and how do we value the arts as a society? Because they say budgets are moral documents. So if we look at countries overall, the country of Germany spends about $11 billion on arts and culture. The city of Berlin, $680 million. And of course, our appropriation for the NEA is $146 million. So it is stark, but it is important to look at this in terms of overall percentage of GDP. Most Western nations are about 1%. Germany is a little bit higher at 2%, but France, Britain, and many others are about 1% of GDP is spent on arts and culture. Unfortunately, we are not at 1%. We're not at a 1/10 of a percent or a 100th of a percent, right? 0.005%. So it's important to kind of understand that landscape. However, it's also important to understand that we have a very thriving foundation community, many of which are funding the important work that all of you are doing. So I wanted to give you a quick snapshot of this as it relates to diversity as well. The total foundation giving is about $22 billion. Okay? Of that, arts and culture grants are $2.3 billion. Of that, only $200 million benefit underserved communities, and $100 million are focused arts funders. The quick takeaway from that to understand is that those funders in the foundation community who are focused on the arts give less to fund underserved communities than those who don't fund the arts. That is just the unfortunate reality. There is also a huge distribution gap, so this is something we should talk about. If we look at all arts organizations, those that have a budget more than $5 million represent less than 2% of all arts organizations in the country, yet they receive 55% of all of the funding. Just to break that down, unfortunately, there may be a few more murmurs at this one. However, if we just take the top 50 organizations, the top 50 arts organizations, which represent 0.0005% of all arts organizations, those 50 organizations receive half of all foundation funding in our country for arts and culture. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, which did this study, talks about this pronounced imbalance restricting the expressive life, and that the asymmetry disadvantages all of us, which takes me back to what Chimamanda Adichie said about the fact that we are not sharing all of the stories. We are not sharing the complete picture of who we are as a people, as a nation. So to give you kind of just this example, I think about the what if our public funding looked like other nations. So I tried to come up with the best kind of comparison that I could. So again, at the NEA, and we're always obsessed with our appropriation, especially sitting on the council, and it's about $146 million. So I said, what other public source can we look to that relates in some ways to the arts? And there is one which relates to music, which is the military bands. So the military bands, this doesn't include personnel, it falls under a different line item. So just the annual budget for the military bands is more than double the entirety of the National Endowment for the Arts, all arts in our country. And there's a reason for that, because there is no doubt about the relevance of music in the military. Huge history that relates to it. So we have to be proactive about making this argument for why the work that we all do day in and day out is so important. So I wanted to close and just thought I'd share this brief clip from a piece that I did, but again, just to share that a lot of this multidisciplinary work that involves some film and music and spoken word, some of these things that we can try to make comments on issues that affect us and try to inspire people to make a change. And so this is just a very quick clip of this piece that I wrote called Arts Wall that I did with Yo-Yo and Lara Downs.
Like Maya, still I rise and speak out to state the character of my state lies not in doubt. When the art of children still fills our tenement halls.
So it's just a short clip from it. But I just ask you to think about this speech, if possible, differently, and what would happen. And what if you choose to take just one thing I've shared and empower it to change just a part of your work, or a part of your life, or a part of your community? And what if you evolve not only your own art house, but the entire field in a way that is truly transformative? And what if you take what in the end are just words that I have to share with you today, but you actually make them tangible? And ultimately, what if you change just one more life in your community than you would have before this conference that you're about to experience? You see Patrice Jackson over here. She's a Sphinx alum, and I was in Atlanta, and she was able to perform before Coretta Scott King. It was a philanthropy conference. It was one of those incredible moments in my life. And Mrs. King came up to me afterwards, and she shared the importance of it, and she shared the importance of music in her and Martin's life. You know, they met at a conservatory. They met at the New England Conservatory of Music, where she was. And he grew up with a piano in the home, and she talked about the importance of music in the social movement and in their work. And especially on this day, it reminds me of the words of her husband, who said that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And I submit to all of you the diversity, the inclusion, the complete stories that you can weave in your art houses matters more than ever. So thank you so much for inviting me to be able to be here with you today. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.